Since 1945, the United Nations has been an organization that has sought to minimize global conflict by bringing countries from across the world together in a forum of peaceful debate and compromise. The forerunner to the United Nations, the League of Nations, came together in 1919 with a similar goal following World War I. Considering the fact that another world war ignited only 20 years after its inception, the League failed in its central mission. However, it would serve as a foundation for the system of globalized peace and diplomacy that we are so familiar with today. With this in mind, it is important to understand what the intention of the League of Nations was, why it failed, and how it acted as a blueprint for the United Nations.
The original idea for the League of Nations came from the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who initially proposed the concept as a part of his 14 points for peace following the First World War. Wilson's final point of those 14 described a general association of nations formed under specific
covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Therefore, there would no longer be alliances or special covenants and understanding, only the general and common family of the League of Nations.
The League sought to end the realist system of international relations characterized by secret treaties and alliances, and introduce a model for diplomacy and international cooperation. Under this model, collective discussion and rational solutions were prioritized over the rash decisions and selfish interests of individual nations.
The League Covenant represented a revolution in international relations. You saw the abandonment of concepts like the balance of power, exclusive alliances in favor of a system of collective security, and under this system, member nations vowed to respect and preserve the territory of and independence of all the other member nations.
The League wasn't designed to simply outlaw war. Instead, it sought to address conflict by providing a space for peaceful debate and reflection for international relations.
My consumption of the League of Nations was that it should operate as an organized moral force of men throughout the world whenever or wherever wrong and aggression were planned or contemplated. The League would be turned upon them.
The collective judgment of the League of Nations must replace the rights of each state to be the judge of its own case. The collective power of the community must replace the old right of the individual state to take the law into its own hands.
Although the creation of an institution like the League of Nations was a historic feat, it was not the first of its kind. The idea dates back to the second half of the 19th century.
The League relied upon ideas that had been percolating long before the Great War. The notion of an international peace organization had been around for centuries prior to World War I. The Concert of Europe that emerged from the last Grand Peace of 1815, combined with the growth of international peace movements and the Hague conferences at the turn of the century, helped familiarize the international community with multilateralism and dispute resolution. But the war ultimately legitimized the effort to establish an organization that could secure lasting peace.
Those at the London Peace Conference from 1912 to 1913 believed that the Concert of Europe was still fortified enough to prevent the outbreak of war in the 20th century. But the concert was a voluntary system, and its power therefore lay entirely in the support and participation of its members. There were a few at the time who advocated for a new security apparatus that had the power to compel members to action. And after the concert's failure in preventing World War I, advocates for the League of Nations knew that it had to be an organization with more authority.
The League was more formal than the concert, with particular features to promote the peaceful resolution of dispute.
The key to a collective security that the League of Nations desired was the aggression be met by automatic and unequivocal sanctions.
8 months after the proposal of his 14 points, Wilson elaborated on his post-war vision in a speech to the American people. He took this opportunity to advocate further for the League of Nations and explain its importance for establishing a lasting peace in Europe.
It will be necessary that all who sit down at the peace table shall come ready and willing to pay the price, the only price that will procure it, and ready and willing also to create in some virile fashion the only instrumentally by which it can be made certain the agreements of peace will be honored and fulfilled. That price is impartial justice in every item of the settlement. No matter whose interest is crossed, not only impartial justice, but the satisfaction of the several peoples whose fortunes are dealt with. That indispensable instrumentality is a League of Nations formed over the covenants that will be effectuous without such an instrumentality by which the peace of the world can be guaranteed. Peace will be rest and part upon the words of outlaws and only upon that word.
The war was over in November, and it was up to Wilson to convince the rest of the Allies to join his cause.
I told them, if you keep out of the League, war will come soon. But if you go into it, it will never come. All the nations that Germany meant to crush and reduce to the status of tools in their own hands were redeemed by the war and given the guarantee of the strongest nation of the world that nobody would invade their liberty again.
However, although Wilson was able to garner support from France and Britain, he did fail to convince his own government, which voted down the resolution.
A central reason for the failure of the League of Nations was that it lacked the membership of the United States. President Wilson's request to join the League was rejected by the United States Congress, with Senator Henry Cabot Lodge acting as his primary opponent. Wilson still supported the League where he could, but without its foremost founding member, the League remained relatively weak.
The League of Nations has also been criticized as the League of Victors for leaving out the losers of the war. While a few of these nations were allowed to become members later, their initial exclusion seemed to counter the purpose of the League and its ideals. This pushed nations like Germany into isolation, and the world reverted back to self-interest in the old alliance system.
They impose a victor's peace on the losers of war, especially Germany.
The people who made such immense sacrifices demanded that their fate be decided by open, unreserved exchange of ideas. But the German people were excluded from the League of Nations, to which entrusted all work of common interest to the world. A genuine League of Nations would have embraced all people of goodwill, even enemies.
This prejudice was accompanied by favor and privilege for larger nations over smaller ones, even within the League's membership. In many ways, the League was co-opted by nations like France and Britain as a vehicle to pursue their own international, economic, and colonial interests.
The League of Nations symbolized this utopian ideal championed by Wilson that the nations of the world would act, not in their best interests, but for the collective benefit of all. But this time again, it contradicted its commitment to self-determination and collective security because the larger nations in the League were more interested in Central and Eastern Europe than the rest of the world.
In spite of its original intention, the leadership of the League of Nations was primarily Britain and France. This was exclusive. They had an agenda, and the smaller nations quickly realized their needs and security were not being taken seriously.
The League had not sufficient unity to overcome the conflicts of nationalistic interests with the dominant group of the great powers, and a loose confederation which only could act in the unanimous consent of the individual governments. The failure of leading members of the confederation to agree was fatal, especially when states outside the confederation cannot be counted to support such limited measures.
So these smaller nations began to prioritize their own security, and the other nations like Belgium and Ireland became neutral, while the larger nations reverted to the policies and the alliances of their own parent.
The clue lies in the name, the League of Nations. Not states or countries, nations. Woodrow Wilson made a peace which created a world of nations, but he formed a league which relied on moral persuasion and collective security. And as a result, the League never had any chance of success. As soon as any of its nations felt that their national self-interest was threatened, the League would become defunct.
The League was also undone by its failure to succeed at its most foundational mission, to prevent war. Even before World War II, Italy, one of the several disaffected members of the League, defied the League's authority and invaded Ethiopia. When criticized by the League for its aggression, Italy just simply left.
The League of Nations was doomed by a lack of unified support, and it ultimately failed to stop any of the regional conflicts on the continent leading up to World War II.
The success of the Italian campaign against Ethiopia, despite the condemnation of the public and the economic sanctions applied by the League, led to a general reaction on the part of the public opinion in the United States to the League as being a failure. Thus, the inability of the League to meet its own vital problem to any legal system, the maintenance of order in the international community, and the protection of rights of person and property, proved to be its undoing.
Lacking a mode of enforcement for its decisions, and without control over non-member nations, the League was reduced to a policy of appeasement, which enabled Hitler's rise to power and therefore helped lead to World War II. Threats of sanctions were never actually carried out, while the League effectively allowed the Germans to remilitarize the Rhineland.
In response to growing German, Russian, and Japanese aggression in 1935, a British newspaper wrote, "Recent events have shown that the British people's hope that the League of Nations would be adequate for the maintenance of peace was premature. An additional expenditure on the armaments of the defense services can no longer be postponed."
In June 1935, Britain made a naval agreement with Hitler to let Germany have a navy 1/3 of the size of Britain's. It was the sign that Britain had given up on the League as a way to keep the peace and was trying to keep a new policy, appeasement.
A year later, in March of 1936, British diplomat Harold Nicolson wrote to a friend, saying, "The covenant of the League has been violated. We shall therefore have to climb down, and Hitler has scored. We must swallow this humiliation as best we may, and be prepared to become the laughingstock of Europe. I do not mind that very much, but it does mean the final end of the League, and that I do mind dreadfully, quite dreadfully."
By 1939, another world war had effectively begun. The Soviet Union was expelled from the League after invading Finland, joining Japan, Germany, and Italy, who had already withdrawn from the League.
Despite the League's failure to prevent World War II, it provided an important foundation for the organization that would be founded to prevent a third world war, the United Nations.
The connections between the United Nations and the League of Nations are largely downplayed today because the League has been so widely discredited as a failure. But most of the founding ideas enshrined by the League, including the commitment to collective security, multilateralism, and self-determination, actually provided the basis for the United Nations.
Similar to the League of Nations, the United Nations has, in addition to its elected, non-permanent members, an executive council consisting of a few permanent, unelected members. The League of Nations was also the first international institution to recognize rights for refugees and ethnic minorities, which the United Nations has now replicated. Finally, the United Nations has also followed the League's example in setting up various commissions dedicated to particular missions across the world.
The United Nations had the benefit of learning from the League of Nations. The League taught it three important lessons: construct the political moment before being held hostage to it, reconcile power with principle, and establish something more universal with a greater emphasis on development and human rights.
So, while the League of Nations failed, and many of its goals were left unfulfilled, its commitment to peace ultimately have been taken on by the United Nations.